I mean, I guess we read for many different reasons. Sometimes we read just to get some information. Sometimes we read for pleasure, right? Sometimes we may even read to try and learn something that's going to change our lives. But actually, I'd like to say that reading is much more complex than we sometimes think. We're so used to reading, we learn to read at an early age, maybe 5 or 6. By the time we're adults, maybe we've read hundreds of books. But there was a time when very few people could read, and there was a time before that when nobody could read because there were no books and there was no writing. And this was a very different time for human beings when there was no writing, no reading. And according to some historians in particular, I'm thinking of one called Walter Ong, he thinks that the emergence of writing, and therefore reading, brought about a fundamental change in human consciousness. Not just simply because we could learn information by looking at a Wikipedia article, but he suggests that through writing and therefore through reading, our consciousness changes. In fact, we evolve, we become more complex beings as a consequence of being able to write and therefore read. This is really quite a radical idea. Because I think we don't tend to think of reading, or necessarily we don't think of reading as something that changes us. But he's suggesting that through developing this ability to write and then read, we actually change the kind of beings that we are. But I think that in recent decades, perhaps, a change has come about in the way that we read and perhaps why we read. And I'm thinking in particular about the emergence of the internet. I had to tell you that before the internet was around, I used to read a lot. And I used to read a lot of long books. And my memories of reading books like the Brothers Karamazov, Les Miserables, other long classic novels, they're still with me, they're still in my mind. I can't necessarily remember all of the details, but I have this sense that through reading those books, I was somehow enlarged, my imagination expanded. I became somehow, not exactly sure how, a bigger person. But these days it's so much easier to kind of turn to the internet, maybe to read a summary of a book, rather than to read the book itself, which I think is a very different thing. Okay, you may know who the main characters in the plot are, you may know what happens in the novel, but you haven't had the experience of entering into the world of that novel, into the world of that book, which is a transformative process. So not just novels, but also spiritual texts, Buddhist texts. And I'd like to say that if we read a scripture, we don't read a scripture in order to find information out. That may be something that we learn. We may learn some information about the history of Buddhism, but in part we read it as a spiritual practice. And what that means is to enter into the world of that scripture. So if we think about a scripture like the Lotus Sutra, for instance, the Lotus Sutra is a universe. It itself is a universe that we enter into. And through absorbing the images and the symbols of that text, we become changed, we become absorbed in that universe and transformed by it. It is as though we could say the book is an icon that enables us to look upon the spiritual dimension, to kind of touch it almost directly. It's really, really difficult to say how reading Sangharakshita's books has changed me, because I've been reading his books for 25 years now, and it's very, very hard to remember not having read quite a few of them. But I do remember when I first came across the True Ratna movement during my early years, I read many, many of his books, and even many of the obscure pamphlets that are very difficult to get hold of these days. I just read as much as I possibly could. And probably I have to be honest and say I've forgotten an awful lot of what I read. However, what I mainly feel is that reading all of those texts, reading all of those pamphlets, enabled me in some way to absorb Sangharakshita's sensibility. It's almost like to absorb the way that he thinks about the Dharma, the way that he engages with a particular topic or a particular problem. And I certainly don't want to say that I've learned to do the same as him, because obviously I'm a unique person, I'm different. But I do feel that in an important way I've absorbed something of the way in which he approaches the Dharma. And I find that it just comes out all of the time in everything that I say, in all of the classes that I'm involved in. It's not that I find myself repeating what he says, but I'm aware that the way that I think, the way that I approach a topic has been informed by all of those things that I've read and studied, and I feel really enriched by that. Another thing that I'd like to say is that, well, it's not necessarily very easy to meet Bhante on a physical level these days. You know, he's not so well. The movement is very big. Clearly not everybody can meet him. However, everybody, because pretty much everybody can read, can meet him through his books. And I'd like to suggest that actually through reading his books, we can have a very, very powerful encounter with Sangharakshita, a very powerful encounter. We can enter into dialogue with Sangharakshita through reading his books, and through that dialogue we can ask him questions, and through that dialogue he can answer questions, and we ourselves can be enriched, we can be transformed by that process of dialoguing with a text written by Sangharakshita. I find that a really exciting possibility, and I feel that that's been my experience over many years, and I continue to enjoy to do that. In fact, ironically, I'd like to say that in some respects I feel that I've had a much deeper dialogue with Sangharakshita through his books than I have done on the physical plane, if you like. It's actually making me think about this idea of different bodies. In Buddhism there's an idea of a trikaya. We have the Nirmanakaya, the physical body, the Sambhogakaya, the body of the imagination, and the Dharmakaya, the body of truth. And I think maybe there's a bit of a tendency, perhaps in Western culture, to over-focus on the physical body, and to think that the physical body and the physical being is the most important one, is the most important being. But I feel that through engaging with Bhante's body of texts, we can engage with his imagination. We can be enriched by his imagination, and that's going to continue long after he's passed away. One of the things that I like to do is to read some of the books that have been created from Sangharakshita's seminars, because some of the material in those books, you can see that he's very much thinking out loud, and the thinking that you read in those books is very, very fresh and vivid. And sometimes he comes out with quite remarkable statements. Just right now I'm rereading his book Wisdom Beyond Words, which is a fantastic text, a fantastic commentary on the Heart Sutra and on the Ratnaguna Samchayagata. But one of the remarks that he makes there, which I don't remember reading in the past, he says something like, when we realise we know nothing, everything is possible. And this statement just struck me with such force, and I've been thinking about it ever since. When we read these texts, particularly those that have been edited from seminars, you come across these little jewels here and there, and you think, wow, did he say that? Is that really what he's saying there? And you're sitting there puzzling over it, trying to work out what it really means. And you feel like your imagination is being stretched. It's not simply the old answer being trotted out. It's not just the same thing again and again. It's something to make you think, something to push you deeper in your thinking about the Dharma. And that's what really excites me about reading a range of his works, because you'll read one work, and one work might be a fairly straightforward presentation of a topic, because for the particular audience he has in mind, that was his intention. But then you might read another one where his audience was quite different, and he says something quite different, and he makes you realise that he's not a dogmatic person, he's not a dogmatic thinker, he's a very creative thinker, and he has new thoughts all of the time, and these have gone into many different writings, many different seminars, which we now have the opportunity to read through all of the different books.
For me, to read Sangharakshita's books is a unique experience, because I can have a contact with those books, but it's not just intellectual contact, it's also emotional contact, and even with the body. It's very, very, very strange, but I really like it. And I get lots of inspiration from Sangharakshita's books, so I can feel lots of energy talking to my heart, feeding my heart, and it is incredible. Actually, I wanted to ask for ordination or to become a mitra because I read Bante's poetry and that I really like. So, well, it doesn't happen if I read other books or other authors. It is just a connection, a strange connection that I feel with Bante's books because they clearly speak to my heart.
So why do you think we should read books by Sangharakshita?
Okay, first of all, I think that he has a great approach for the Western people, actually. Second, because I think that's the way that we can get to meet Bante. And finally, because I think it can help us to develop our practice, actually. We can search what is better for us in order to practice Buddhism. It's really interesting because I think by reading him in different books, I get to know him in different ways, and some of them make me feel like I am not alone in some things on my practice, or sometimes they give me some points or some things that I was looking for.
Which is your favourite book?
I think it's The Priceless Jewel.
What is it about that book that you like so much?
Symbols, images. There's one chapter that I really love because I like the lion thing, the one that is called Revisited, Saint Joseph Revisited. Saint Jerome Revisited, and I really like that one. I think it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you read a book like The Priceless Jewel, you can get quite a different impression of the person that Bante is.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to have many different voices,
yes,
and many different guises in different texts, and through reading the whole range of his works you can get a sense of the breadth of him as a person.
Mm-hmm. That's what I actually love that book, because I have been reading many books from him, but this is the first time that I met different Sangharakshita, and I really loved it actually. That's the main reason.
I mean, do you feel in a sense that when you're reading a book by him that you're in some kind of communication?
Yes, actually. For example, in the Sangharakshita, New Voice in the Buddhist tradition. Exactly. It's really easy to catch out when Subhuti talking and when Bante talking, and I really like that feeling. It's like you're having this conversation with them, so it's really alive. Actually.